Well, hello, welcome to Adoption Matters, a podcast with real people sharing real stories and getting real about adoption from all three perspectives of the adoption triad. Kim Noeth, a birth mother, one of our co-hosts, is unable to be with us today, but I have with me today Sharon Butler-Obazee, who is an adoptee, and myself, Sally Ankerfelt, an adoptive parent. Together, we explore difficult topics, share frank conversations, guided by our commitment to truth-telling and truth-seeking.
We're so glad to have you with us today. We're going to revisit a podcast that we originally recorded last year. The focus is on adopted fathers in that fatherly position. You know, there's so much talk about Mother's Day, and fathers sometimes get ignored. So we thought it was important to bring their thoughts to you about what comes up for them when they think of fathers. So we're going to hear from an adoptee, an adoptive father, and a birth parent who is also a father. Anyway, today we're going to hear from all three, and I hope you enjoyed this edition.
Thanks so much for being willing to join us. This month, we're talking a little bit about the thoughts that come to mind when we think about Father's Day. And we've invited three fathers, all who are in the adoption community, to share their thoughts and opinions about some of the things that come up when they hear, or are preparing for Father's Day, both as a father yourself and maybe even your relationship with your own father. Thomas, can we start with you?
Sure. So as far as Father's Day goes, um, I guess that means I gotta do the cooking, right? Is that how that works? No. Anyway, so Father's Day, I have my child, my birth child, and the child that I placed. We just got to see him for Mother's Day. I don't generally get thought of as much for Father's Day, and that's okay as far as I'm concerned. My job is to you know, be the supportive role and to make sure everybody's taken care of. But you know, he's asking questions, about did you not love me? And yep, no, we loved you, dude. It was a bad situation for us, and we were able to place you into a home with two loving parents, and you got to experience things we might not have been able to give to you at the time. Our current experience has changed, so we are able to help out one of my child that lives at home's best friends for the past 4 years. He's living with us now because he needed help. So we're able to do that. um it is what it is. um I don't know how much more I have to say about that, but any questions and whatnot, I gladly respond to.
And
So, Tho-
just to recount a little, you and your wife stayed together after you placed. So when you visit
Oh, yes.
your child is able to visit with both their birth mother and birth father. Would that be accurate?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. No, no. Me and my wife were together. We were together. I want to say 12, 14 years when we decided to place. We were. I was in a job. I mean, I was working all the time, but it didn't pay for a lot. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment with my son, and he stayed in the bedroom. We basically turned the living room into a studio apartment, and um, when we found out we were pregnant again, we couldn't. I didn't want to bring another child into that kind of situation, that kind of crowded situation, and my wife's mother had placed a child in adoption when she was younger for different reasons. So we thought going with adoption was a good thing. So it's an open adoption, a nice LGBTQ community couple that live close to us. So we see them like 4 times a year, and it's generally as a group. We see them Mother's Day. I kind of let the moms do their thing. Besides, I got to work. But no, we get to see him, and it's a group thing, and we communicate and keep in contact. And I know that we are luckier than some in that regard.
Yes, yes. And I think your son is very fortunate too to have both his birth mother and birth father active in his life. So thank you
Yeah.
so much for sharing. Thank you, Tom. TC,
Welcome.
how about you? You want to share a little bit about your place in the the adoption constellation and what comes to mind for you when you hear father?
Sure. It just, this is a muscle that I'm building, which is dismantling my own ableism. And one of the things that sort of folks in the disability have communicated to me and taught me about was visually impaired. A lot of people may be accessing Zooms via just audio. So I did want to sort of describe myself, starting with my pronouns and gender identity. I identify as a cis male. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I am a bald Viet person with a little bit of hair growing on the edges of my head. And I'm wearing sort of retro style glasses and a black t-shirt. So just so, to sort of welcome in anybody who may be accessing this Zoom via audio, just so you can get a sense of who I am. I am an adoptive parent. I adopted my son at age 10 in 2014 with my husband, and he's now 20. And, we are cross-racial. I am Viet, and he is Latinx, Mexican. So that's very complex. And I have never identified as a father. So we have never celebrated Father's Day in any way, shape, or form. My son doesn't call me dad. He calls me by my first name. And I think if somebody says like dad to me, I look who? Mainly because I've always loved the gender neutral term parent. And I have dived into that really, really, really with both feet. But I think because my own relationship with masculinity and my own father has been complex, I've seen a lot of negative masculinity, that it's just never, the term dad or father has never felt right to me. So we've just never celebrated Father's Day. And as a queer person, it's, in a same-sex relationship, it's really, really weird to see that, because, and the other thing that's very interesting for myself is my birthday was Saturday. So it makes sort of like any kind of those parents' day a little bit easier because we just get to celebrate me. It doesn't need to have a label on it other than birthday. So I think that's the dance we have around Father's Day, is that we don't really acknowledge it, and it's not a role we've ever embraced, but we love the term parent, and we love sort of all of that entails. It's just the label of father or dad or whatever has never felt authentic to my own being. So that's kind of how I'm dancing with that.
And I appreciate that distinction because it's true that just the title can bring up some complexity.
Mhm.
Tony, would you be willing to share next a little bit about your place in the constellation and what comes up for you when you hear the term Father's Day?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Kim. So my name is Tony Hynes, he, him, his, and I'm an adoptee. I'm not a father yet myself. I'm an interracial adoptee, which means for me that I had adoptive parents of different race from myself. In my case, I had two white adoptive parents, and my white adoptive parents were two women, two lesbian women. And so I grew up in a house that was a woman-led household, and I didn't have a father that I grew up with. I had what's called an open adoption. So I grew up knowing members of my birth family. I interacted with them from time to time. I saw my birth mom, I saw my birth sister, but I did not see my father growing up. He was an absentee father for me. And I grew up with role models that were around me that were these male role models. But still, when I think of what Father's Day means and what it means to me, usually it means that I am disassociating on that particular day. Usually it means that I'm avoiding. That's the word that I often think of. I'm avoiding social media on that day because I don't like going on social media and saying Happy Father's Day to my dad and seeing all of these pictures of fathers with their sons or with their daughters because it reminds me of loss. It reminds me of my own loss. And one of the first questions that I get about having two moms is, was there a male in the picture? Was there a male father figure for you? And I say, well, yes, there were male role models that I had growing up in my life. And I also had my peers to lean on. So when it comes to that masculinity and where did I find it? I found it in men, I found it in women, I found it in people who helped me understand what it meant to be Tony, what it meant to be a man, and the way that I was coming into my masculinity. But I didn't have a father. I didn't have someone who I called dad ever when I was growing up. And so for me, it's that reminder of, well, what does fatherhood even mean in the first place? Does it mean a biological connection? Because I have that, I have a father in a biological sense, but it also means it's parentage, and it means parentage in a very specific form and shape. And so TC, when you said, we don't celebrate Father's Day, in the house, I identified with that because, we celebrated my parents, my moms. We did celebrate, Mother's Day, but on Father's Day, when I was growing up, I still was really sad on those days, but I was also someone who recognized the impact that my moms were having in my life at the same time. And so you go through someone who's adopted, someone who's an interracial adoptee, someone who has an open adoption, of having these bite-sized pieces of yourself. You have some members of your birth family. You have what it means to be Black in my case, because I had cultural mirrors growing up. But you don't have this other piece that's also really formative and shaping. And it's another reminder for me that when I do become a father, how important that particular role will be for me, and to not just be someone who's viewed biologically that way, but someone who's also viewed in that parentage way too.
Mhm.
True, it is a relational way as well. And I like that you brought that out. There's this part that yes, that you have physical biological father, but the relationship is absent. And I also love the fact that you're considering how are you going to step into that role when you yourself, become a dad. I appreciate you bringing that difficult topic up, because that is true. Sometimes we have a misassociation or a different association with what it is, who a father is and how they are. Sally, do
And
you
can
and
I
Karen?
ask,
Yes, please, TC.
yeah, can I ask for Thomas and Tony, because I am in public health, and I like to say I like to take a landscape view of things as opposed to portrait. So portrait is, how do we as individuals do things? What do we do? How is our behavior? But I also know, landscape is about like systems. How are we impacted by systems and institutions? And so the question I have for the two of you is, as you have a not necessarily a cookie cutter relationship idea and formation of the role of father, like, what have systems and institutions done to either support or hold you back from defining that? Because I always want, what I always like to do is also like analyze, like, did you get the support you needed as a birth father to really have an authentic and open relationship with the child that you place? Did you, Tony, as somebody whose father may not have been as present, have systems and institutions to either reflect your identity or ones that really let you down? I'm very curious about that, because I always like to take a systems mindset, because we're not islands. We don't just come about through our own sense of being and behavior. We're very interconnected. And so I'm curious about how you saw systems and institutions supporting or challenging how you formed, your own ideas about fatherhood, whether that be something you've taken on yourself or how you see other sort of people taking on a fatherhood role.
Excellent questions. Tony, would you like to go first?
Sure. So fantastic question, TC there. And first and foremost, I want to say that I am and was affected by systems. We all are in different ways. And adoptees are affected by unique ways by the system of adoption that privileges adoptive parents, that privileges typically white adoptive parents. and privileges heterosexual adoptive parents too. And so in my case, you saw those systems reflected in my particular adoption, because I was adopted in the mid 90s by, as I said, my two moms, my two white lesbian moms. But then 3 months after that adoption, it was actually overturned. So that adoption was overturned. And it was overturned by a panel of judges who had decided that this white same-sex set of household was not the right household to raise a Black child in. Eventually, a joint custody agreement was arranged between my birth family, my adopted family. So you already see systems there that are deciding who is able to become a family and who is not able to become a family. And it's impacted by the relationship that the birth family has with the court, with the adopted family. I learned when I was growing that my father wasn't in the picture at all. So that's what I thought. And then 15, actually it was 20 years later, I learned that my father was actually in the picture for the first year and a half of my life, which actually made a huge difference in my perception of him, because I didn't know that he'd read any bedtime stories to me or anything like that. A lot of times the systems that we have in place will say, well, your father, and sometimes our own parents will say, your father was this and that, and he wasn't here, he wasn't that. And a lot of times systems really see things in this black and white way that don't allow us to look at the holistic nature and picture of who a person is, and of course then who the system is too. And was I able to be supported by the system and how I was coming into formulating what a parent, what a father was for me? No, I was not, because the system only told me what I didn't have in relation to a biological parent father. There wasn't an understanding of, well, he doesn't have this, so maybe it's really important that we make sure that there are role models and supportive systems, and maybe there are other ways that we can view parentage in general. And I think, TC, what happens too is I'm affected by systems, but I'm also knowing that other people that are interacting with me are also impacted by those same systems. And it's also often systems of thought. So because I had two moms, the question that I would get once in a while was, who's the dad among your two moms here? And I would say, well, they're my two moms. Like, what do you mean? Well, who plays the dad role there? And I say, well, what do you mean by that? And so then I understood that dads were supposed to play, in quotation marks, specific roles stereotypically in a child's life. And so then that became something that was supposed to become ingrained in me, that didn't actually become ingrained in me, because I saw both of my moms playing the roles that people said that dads typically were supposed to be playing. Who's playing with you in the park? Who's, reprimanding you? That's supposed to be the dad's role. And so systems of thought, systems in society are impacting those things. And my family was a family that really talked openly about, well, both of us can play these types of roles. But at the same time, I also knew that, again, as I mentioned before, that there was loss in terms of having that male role model figure in the home on a day in, day out basis. And understanding my own body, for example, as a boy who was becoming a teenager and then becoming a man, I didn't have a male in the house to help me understand that particular process, right? Or my hair is shorter, my mom's hair is longer, and I'm Black and they're white. And so there are these different intersectional things that go along with manhood, and in my case, what it means to also be a Black man, that systems didn't prepare for, and systems also had stereotypical views of. I was called an angry child by the system, by the court system. And so my father was called, an absentee, deviant father, in terms of having multiple children from that angle. And so there are these ways that the systems are impacting how I was looking at men, looking at fathers, and then also looking at Black men too. And if I wasn't someone who was able to interact with these other positive, role models and do my own history and homework, then those systems would have greatly impacted how I was viewing men in those intersectional ways.
I think there
Thomas,
was a question in there for you too, Thomas, but you need to unmute to be able to answer.
Is that better? All right. So, I mean, uh, I'm an older individual. I'm going to be 50 this year, so I'm from an older school. To be perfectly honest, society as a general rule, men are supposed to take care of the kids and to support the house and all that kind of jazz. Um, there wasn't a lot of support for me as a birth father for having. They didn't see, well, why did you want to place the child? They didn't understand that it was out of love and it was for a better reason. I do know that not all situations are that way or whatever. But there's a lot of question. There's a lot of look. Oh well, you couldn't take care of them. Couldn't take care of them the way I wanted to take care of them at the time. So that's why we made the choice that we made. Um, I find that a lot of the birth parents are generally ladies led because the man doesn't want nothing to do with them or whatever reason. There's a lot. So I think as far as fathers on my side of the birth constellation or whatever you folks call it, we are far less and we don't shine as bright because society as a general tends to take a negative view. They also take a negative view in general of placing a child. I believe people like to question my wife, well, why, and this and that, and nobody knows the shoes that we walked in or whoever walked in. We don't know their story. um you know and I just think that there were no systems for support for myself. I tried to make a like a Facebook support group for parents, birth fathers, but they weren't really into it. We're men, we're not supposed to talk about our feelings, blah blah blah, whatever. um but I'm sure there are some out there that are concerned and they have their own grief. I have grief over the situation, but my grief takes a backseat to my wife's grief, being that she's the one who carried the child, and I think in the birth community, the mothers are put in a higher tier than the fathers are, but that's just because there's more of them. There's multiples of them, and there's they do have a stronger connection physically than like myself, who is an emotional kind of a connection. um I'm not sure if that really answered TC's question properly, but that's kind of my outlook on it.
No, narratives are systems too. So that's really good to hear sort of like the system of narratives that have impacted you of like who's considered a birth parent. What is the visualization that society has of a birth parent? And it's usually female. And also the visualization of grief, just because men are not sort of in broader society allowed to share emotions, like who gets public grief is also something that's really important to hear from you as a birth father, of like, where you get the systems of where you get to like let out your emotions. And also, in a way, what I heard from both of you was that whole dynamic of birth father feels a little bit dangerous because of what media and society has portrayed of birth fathers as a binary of either present or absentee versus the gray area in between. Because I heard Tony say, like, your dad actually did have a presence in your life for 1.5 years physically, and influenced and impact. And for Thomas, like that, you carry, your child with you in an emotional way, even if you didn't carry them in a physical way. And being able, I think it's sort of like in terms of systems and institutions, not having institutions recognize that bond because it's not a physical bond, it has a lot of ripple effects and repercussions. So I'm sorry taking over as I usually do because I'm a yapper, but I'll hand it over to the people actually holding this conversation.
That was a great addition, TC. Thank you for helping us bring those points across because they were valuable.
Yeah, I'm just taking it all in and listening with great respect on how open all three of you have been about this conversation. And one thing that keeps coming in my head is how we as people create boxes for other people to the point where we start losing the complexity, and I'm also going to say the beauty, the texture of what it means to be something like a father, family, whatever it is that we put on that. And Father's Day, is kind of like Mother's Day too, and they're kind of the same in which this construct has been placed around us, and it doesn't minimize the wonderful ways people celebrate the day and that it's life-giving. I'm not wanting to minimize it. However, I want to recognize that for many, many families, these kinds of constructs don't fit, and they can cause, a layer that maybe I'm hoping that someday we as a society can revisit that and think about it. I mean, even Tony, what you were saying too about just the way we define, who is a good father? What is this good idea? You didn't use that word, but I mean, we do put labels on it with our words without even probably knowing it and sometimes knowing it, right? And that's labels that can really harm. So thank you. I want to thank you personally. I mean, this has been really amazing for me.
I too, Sally, will join in applauding all three of you for coming forward with your stories and your interaction in this fatherhood space. I notice just getting out of Mother's Day and being a mother that it seems to me that it's an imbalance here. When it comes to Mother's Day, it's like a full bouquet. And when it comes to Father's Day, there's only one rose. So there's sort of like this imbalance going on with the construct of our systems as a society and how we view these two important relationships with a child. But for Thomas and TC, I just wanted to ask you, what were your relationships with your own fathers?
Difficult. I'll say that. My father has learned to be less authoritarian. The story I give about my parents' relationship, because my mother has been the executive director of different nonprofits. She has served on the White House Commission for Asian Americans and Hispanics. He was President Clinton wanted to nominate her to be the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. She decided not to because she wanted to not uproot our family. And with all of that, growing up, when the phone is on my father's side of the bed, but if it rings in the middle of the night, my mother has to get up and go to the other side of the bed and pick it up. That is the dynamic, and it's why my father is very authoritarian, and I think hasn't really come to terms with his own temper and his own trauma coming out of his temper, and so I really distance myself from that. And it's why I distance myself from the role of father versus parent, because it's really problematic. I never wanted to be authoritarian. I always wanted to be, I've never wanted to sort of say because I told you so. I've always wanted to negotiate, which is a good and bad thing when it comes to parenting. And it's something, again, shades of gray where the sweet spot is always in between, but it's difficult. My relationship with my father is getting better, and part of what getting better is me becoming an adult. Like in this last, a couple of years ago over Christmas, I was home, and I'm within driving distance, at least a 7-hour drive to my parents' house, and my father started yelling at me and saying really nasty things to me, and I just spent 5 minutes speed packing and hauled out, and then got a rain of apology texts. And part of it is my own agency to be able to do that and have the class ability to just walk away, because I know it's about having the money to have a car to just drive off and not be trapped, you know, having like the racial ability to go away and like be dysregulated and maybe drive a little too fast and know that like the police aren't going to pull me over. You know, I can leave, you know, and agency is a core thing for me. And it's, I've never associated fatherhood with agency. I've associated being a child and growing into a child role as an adult child with agency. So it's why I've never, that role has never landed, because the person who played that role growing up has been deeply problematic. We are doing a lot of healing, you know, and part of that healing is my ability to walk away and let him sit in his own experience. But that's kind of like my experience of, you know, of sort of like growing up under a father.
Okay, so Thomas, if you would unmute yourself, I'd like to hear your answer too.
Me and my father, I don't think TC's alone in that there is a time frame where you beef with your father and you guys aren't kosher. My father, when I was 4 months old, my mother severely abused me, fractured my skull, all kinds of things. So he was a single father with me for a little while before my stepmothers became involved. Then, of course, as a teenager, there was, you know, the conflict that you're naturally going to have with your father. As an adult, it's been a lot better, and now my father is suffering from some cognitive issues and some possible Alzheimer's dementia issues. So now I'm taking more of the father role with him, and you know, making sure, hey, did you do this? We got to do this. We got to, you know, we got to keep up on that. You know, so now I would say my relationship with my father is good, which is part of the reason that I try to be a good father to my children, or as the best father that I can be. Um, but you know, there are bumps in the road with being a father with a child, you know, and I'm sure the same with a mother and a daughter, or you know, whatever. You know, kids are kids, and they get to be teenagers, and they're all stupid, and we're all stupid as adults. You know, that's kind of the way that goes. Um, so, but I mean, I would say now it's a good relationship. Depending on when you asked me previously, that might not have been the same answer.
Oh, I did want to say, Thomas, that you're not the oldie. I turned 52 on Saturday, so you're the young chicken to me. You're the young chicken.
Fair enough.
And I had a question for everyone in this space, which is, we all, I mean, what Sally said was we need to think outside of the box. And one of the things that for me is really outside of the box is claiming family. And I'll give a very specific example of that, which is my son and I do not share the same last name. And it was a beautiful act of claiming that made that happen, actually, because, you know, we tried to put ourselves into this lovely box of, you know, being a gay couple, adopting a child, blah, 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 and saying, we'll have a hyphenated last name. And at a certain point, my son said, I don't want to take your name because I'm not Vietnamese. I don't want people to assume that I'm Vietnamese. And I was like, I don't think I want to I don't want to hyphenate my name. My name, my identity as a Viet person means a lot to me, and I don't want to give that up, even to hyphenate. And it was such a gift that my son gave me to sort of be okay with the fact that we can be a family without having the shared thing. There are other things that we share. We all love sushi. He now eats oysters with us. You know, like we all love our dog. You know, there are things that tie us together and we claim each other without having the from the box claiming of we all need to have the same last name. We all need, you know, like one of the lovely things that my son has done is that he uses the term Onoi and Banoi for my parents, which is the Vietnamese word for grandma and grandpa, you know. And so I'm like, that's a form of claiming that I feel like is so powerful. Whereas he doesn't want to take on being Vietnamese because he doesn't feel Vietnamese. he wants to acknowledge he's in a Vietnamese family. So I just wonder, what does, for everybody in this space, what does claiming family look like for you that may be more outside of the box than people think about?
Well, it's a great question again, TC. And I think for me as an adoptee and for us as adoptees, there's this concept of chosen family. And it's not just specific to adoptees, but it's something that a lot of us take with us. And it's important for us to remember why we feel like we have to have this chosen family kind of aspect come into our lives in the first place. Because for most people, I think they would assume, oh, your chosen family, you must be talking about your adopted family because you couldn't grow up with your birth family. But for a lot of us, that's actually not the case because we weren't comfortable growing up in our adoptive households. So we didn't get to grow up in our birth homes, and we don't feel comfortable in our adoptive homes. So we have to claim family for ourselves in kind of this transcendent way when it comes to both adoptive and birth family. And so we decide to claim and to choose people who come into our lives who feel like family to us. And those can be friends, those can be loved ones, those can be our partners, those can be younger children that have come into our lives in some way that we're claiming as family. And all of that claiming of family helps remind us that we are deserving of belonging in a family, that we not only belong to a family, but that we have a sense of belongingness in a family that we now get to choose for ourselves. And so that's really what I have done in my life in terms of claiming family for myself. I felt a sense of belongingness in many ways in my adopted family, but there were specific ways sometimes in which I did not, especially when it came to race. And so there were places and pockets where I could feel a sense of belongingness for myself that were really helpful for me. So I think for a lot of us, that's the claiming that we have to do. But it's hard because we're told, you mentioned systems earlier, that we're supposed to feel grateful or thankful to be members of our adoptive families, and that we should feel kind of inherently a sense of belongingness to those places and those people. And in your case, you, for example, say, hey, you don't have to have my same last name. And your child was like, hey, dad, or hey, TC, I don't want to have your last name. I'm not Vietnamese, so I just want to carry on, my last name. And that's something is something that a lot of adoptive parents don't recognize, and especially not that early on, the power of naming, the power of names. And the fact that they were able to come to you and say that also speaks to the environment that you created and the vulnerability you created there to allow them to feel like they had permission to tell you that. And most adoptees don't feel like we even have permission to even tell our parents that, because there's just inherent belief that, well, you're a member of the family now, you're just like us. And it's like, I'm a member of the family, but I'm not just like you. And I come from my birth family. I have Thomas is my, birth father, for example. I have birth parents here, and I want to carry on their legacy too. And so some of that claiming involves claiming existence and involvement in familyhood amongst these different families, amongst multiple families as well.
I just want to say I resonate with that. By the way, I'm blonde, turning gray, white woman, she, her. So anyway, this is Sally. Yeah, I resonate with that. And I think for an adoptive parent, that expansiveness of understanding is important too for adoptive parents. I remember going to a baby shower that one of my children invited me to, and my child introduced me to his mom and his dad and his brothers and his sisters, called another person mom. And so it was, hey, mom, I want you to meet mom. Now this was not anybody in our family. It wasn't anybody. It was a chosen family. And so my child still thinks of me as mom, but there's an expansiveness of where the rootedness is. It's more than one root. It can be many roots, and it doesn't diminish for me, my role. It but for some people that can be rather jarring, and for me, for a moment, it was. It was jarring, but then I thought about it, and I thought, okay, this is doesn't diminish me. Um, so I think that expansiveness you're talking about, for especially for adoptive parents, is really important, because I think sometimes, I'm going to speak for myself, that I can feel like nervous about, well, what is my role here? Or am I important? Or am I the mom? Or am I the parent? But really, the more we can see that this is expansive, the more our children can come to us. And I think after that shower, my child came over and gave me a big hug and said how much they appreciated that. And so it didn't disconnect, it connected, you know. And I will say too, real quick, that there's that fine line between making sure I feel like our kids know that they are a part of us and will forever be a part of us, and that they don't have to be, it doesn't have to be only us. So that the claiming, like you're talking about, TC, can happen in other ways, but that there's still that, hey, you do belong here, but then we also know that you belong elsewhere.
I love that. And I'll also hop on the expansiveness. Having placed a child and then raised several children afterwards, when my son came back into our life, there's coming into a big family already. There's so much diversity. There's so much going on, that I think as a unit, we all were just messily human, and we were willing to stay in it even when it was awkward, and as we all felt into, okay, well, what do our roles together look like? Sometimes we did a really great job at it, and sometimes it was messy, and we had to come back to each other and be willing to have like these hard conversations and say, hey, I felt a little bit left out, or I was a little offended here. And then that's how we learn. And as a result of that, I've seen that carry over so much to how we as a unit relate to the world. Like, we have this big inclusiveness, because represented in our own unit is so much different diversity and so much else going on, of what, we have my son that I placed, he's gay, and he and his husband, are also stepping into, do we want to become parents in the adoption community now that we know what that looks like? So I think there's so much to being willing to show up, and even in the hard and the messy, learn how to define it together, and recognize that sometimes you're going to do really good. Sometimes, you're going to make mistakes, but if we're committed, in the end, I think that's what draws us together as a family, is our, committedness to each other.
Okay, for me, the adoptee, I'll have to say that my system was a closed adoption. I was not allowed access to any of my birth records or knowledge of anything that had come as a predecessor to my life. So it made me feel like I was in a box where I had no choice. As I walked through life and realized I wanted to know more about my identity, I was that idea was smothered because of the commitment I felt I had to my adoptive parents. So I would not take that step to try and learn about that until after they had passed. So now that they've passed and I went into reunion now with my family, one of the things I identified is that my biological name was Baby Butler. And so now, even though I don't have the authority to put it legally onto a document, I identify as Sharon Butler-Obazee because I want to have that included as a part of my name. It's so that I can realize my identity in who I was before and how I was created. I have now come to learn more about my family and understanding the history and everything else. It's not been a smooth process. I wish I would known them when I was growing up, because now we're all adults and we're sort of like we're holding fast to our own identity as individuals, and we find it difficult sometimes to merge together. So, in terms of what you were asking, I think that's my answer.
Mhm. So I guess that's my turn. So me and my wife have been together for 25 years. She still doesn't have my last last name, which is just fine. And the only person that shares my last name is my trans daughter, whose name was Quentin when she was born and now goes by Luna. So I think the name thing's kind of important, for you to identify as you choose. But as far as our family goes, we don't see things as a family tree. With my son Graham, who we placed with his mothers, we see it now as more of an orchard. We are all the same kind of fruit. We just different trees and different limbs, and some entangle, some don't. And currently in my own house, I have me and my daughter, and then my daughter's best friend from childhood who lives with us now, and he has a different last name, and my wife who has a different last name, and her brother, which I am less fond of, but still family, I suppose, that I take care of. He has another last name. So I guess family is what you make of it, and you don't have to like them always. You do love them, and that's kind of the whole point, right? I mean, love is I want to strangle you, but instead I'm going to make you breakfast. So, that's kind of the way I see the whole family situation, and how you choose who you want to call family. Um, yeah. So there you go. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. Before we close, does anyone have any thoughts they want to share?
I just want to appreciate the space and everybody on the Zoom. I've learned so much, sort of like really has opened my eyes to a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different experiences, because I always think of adoption as sort of like the blindfolded people and the elephant, and where one person feels like it's a snake because it's the trunk, and another person feels like it's tree because it's the leg, and another person will feel like it's a pillow because it's a stomach. And I think like we all are touching the same experience in a completely different way, and it's really always so useful to hear what other people's experience of the experience of adoption is.
I agree. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation today. I hope that we can have many more conversations, and we appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what wonderful sharing. Thank you so much for our guests for taking the time to share with us today and being vulnerable and open and giving us lots to think about.
Exactly.
We want to thank you. Yeah, we want to thank you so much for listening to Adoption Matters, a podcast with real people sharing real stories and getting real about adoption from all three perspectives of the adoption triad. We invite you to join us again next time. Help others find us too by leaving a rating on your favorite podcast platform. We've really enjoyed being with you today. We invite you to join us again, like we said, for another episode of Adoption Matters. And if you need any resources or support, feel free to reach out to us at giftfamilyservices.com. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.